What up, YouTube? This is Mr. T at Mr. T Do Numbers. I'm back at you again with a new lesson on changing fractions into decimals. All right, or like I say, converting from fraction language into decimal language. All right, say, Mr. Tran, why on God's green earth would I have to change a fraction into a decimal? Because sometimes your problem is speaking two different languages. Sometimes your problem has fractions in it and decimals in it at the same time, right? But ask yourself this, is your answer going to be in two different languages? No. The answer is normally either in fractions or it's either in decimals. And most of the time it's going to be in decimals, all right? Especially on Scantrons. Because most Scantrons, especially in elementary, middle school, and high school, most Scantrons just have places for decimals. They don't have places for fractions until you get to like SATs or college or something like that. All right? So most of the time, when you have a problem that has fractions and decimals, more than likely you're going to have to change the fraction into a decimal. So this lesson is converting, I call it a translation lesson. You're translating, you're changing from fraction into a decimal. Now, the value of the number is not changing, just the form of the number. You're changing from fraction form to decimal form, but the value is the same. All right? So I don't want you to think, oh, it's more or oh, it's less. No, you're converting, right? Put it like this, you're changing from water to ice, right? You're just changing forms, all right? So there are some simple steps in changing fractions into decimals, right? Step one, can my denominator turn into tenths, hundredths, or thousands, right? Now you got to think, the ultimate goal is to turn it into a decimal. And the place value spots that you have with decimals behind the decimal point is tenths, hundredths, and thousands. So whatever fraction that you start off with, you have to ask yourself, can that denominator turn into tenths, hundredths, or thousands? Based on whether your denominator that you currently have can change into tenths, hundreds, or thousands, that will determine what decimal spot is going to end in, tenths, hundreds, or thousands. All right? So you got to ask yourself that, right? If you have 1/2, can 1/2 turn into 10? Yeah. 2 times 5. Can 1/2 turn into 100? Yeah. 2 times 50. Can 1/2 turn into 1,000? Yeah. 2 times 500. All right. So, depending on what denominator you have to begin with, that will depend on whether that will determine, whether you're going to turn it into tenths, hundreds, or thousands, based on the number at the bottom that you start off with. Not every denominator can turn into all three. All right. So, once I show you some examples, I'll show you what I mean. All right. Now, step two. After I figure out can I turn it to tenths, hundreds, or thousands, step two, I'm going to actually change the fraction into the base 10 denominators. Mr. Trahan, what's the base 10 denominators? Tenths, hundreds, or thousands. So step one, I determine which one I can change it to. And step two, I turn the fraction that I currently have into an equivalent fraction, a fraction that's equal to it, but that ends in tenths, hundreds, or thousands as the denominator. All right? Step one, you figure out which one you can. And step two, you actually change it. Step three, I'm going to put the numerator in the denominator's spot, the denominator's decimal spot. What do you mean, Mr. Trahan? Once I have a new fraction that ends in tenths, hundreds, or thousands, whatever my numerator is, I'm going to put that numerator in the tenth spot that numerator in the hundred spot or that numerator in the thousand spot, in the decimal spot. All right? So this is the conversion from step 3, putting in the numerator in the denominator spot. I'm literally changing it from fraction into decimal. All right? Step 4, if I have any whole numbers, put the whole number to the left of the decimal point and use zeros if necessary. If you don't have any whole numbers, then you can use a zero. Put a zero to the left. All right? Step 4 is the same. You got to think about it. If you have a fraction, the whole number in front of the fraction is to the left. And if you have a decimal, the whole number is to the left. So it's the same thing. You're going to put the whole number to the left. All right? So those are the basic instructions. Now I'm going to give you several examples. Right? Let's start off with, let's say 2/5. All right? I want to change 2/5 into a decimal. All right? So you ask yourself, can fifths turn into tenths, hundredths, or thousands? All right? How do I determine that? Well, 5 times what gives me 10? 5 times 2 give me 10. I can turn it into tenths. 5 times 20 is 100. Boom, I can turn it into hundreds as well. 5 times 200 gives me 1,000. Man, I can turn it into thousands as well. So when you have something like halves, like I mentioned earlier, or fifths, they can turn it to all 3 decimal spots, right? But for the interest of this example, let's go ahead and turn it into tenths. All right, I decided to turn 2/5 into tenths, right? So boom, can my denominator turn? Yeah, it can turn into tenths. That's step 1. Step 2, I'm going to actually change the fraction into tenths. After I determine my spot, now I'm going to do the real conversion into an equivalent fraction, that ends in 10. Right? So you ask yourself, well, how do I get from 5 to 10? Most people say 5 plus 5 is 10. Right? Well, we're not adding when it comes to converting fractions. You're multiplying. So 5 times 2 is equal to 10. All right? And because I want to keep this fraction equivalent, whatever I did to the denominator at the bottom, I have to do to the numerator at the top. 2 times 2 is equal to 4. So now I have completed step 2. I have changed the fraction into a base 10 denominator. This is tenths now instead of fifths. All right? Fifths is not a base 10 spot, but tenths is. Right? So now 2/5 has been converted into 4 tenths. That's step 2. Step 3. I'm going to put the numerator in the denominator's decimal spot. So right now I'm working with 4/10 now. I'm going to put the numerator 4 in the denominator's decimal spot. I'm going to put the 4 in the tenth spot. Well, a 4 in the tenth spot is right behind the decimal point. All right? That's step 3. And step 4, I'm going to put the whole number to the left of the decimal point. I don't have any whole numbers, so use 0 if necessary. So 0.4 is the same thing as 0.4. I don't have a whole number, so I just put a 0 in front. All right? So this is my final answer. 2/5 becomes 0 and 4 tenths. All right? So that's an example of me changing into the tenths place. All right? Now, I'll give you another example. I ain't going to leave you dry. Let's say I have 3/4. Well, I ask myself, 3/4, can it turn into tenths, hundredths, or thousands? Well, 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, not 10. So fourths can't turn into tenths. But if I think about quarters, 4 times 25 is 100. So, because 4 quarters is $1. All right, that means fourths can turn into hundreds. All right, and 4 times 250 could turn into thousands. So I can turn it either into hundreds or thousands, but I can't turn it into tenths because nothing times 4 equals 10. All right, so for this example, I can turn it into hundreds or thousands based on step 1. So for this example, I'm going to use hundreds since I used tenths on the last one. I'm going to turn 3/4 into hundreds. Right? Step 2, I'm going to actually change the fraction into a base 10 denominator, into hundreds. So, like I said, 4 quarters equals 100 cents. So 4 times 25, because a quarter is worth 25. 4 times 25 equals 100. To keep this equal, I have to do the same thing at the bottom to the top number as well. So 3 times 25 is equal to 75, which means 3/4 is equivalent to the base 10 denominator, 75 over 100. Right? See, there's no spot on the decimal for fourths, but there is a spot for hundredths, which is why you're changing it. Because the whole point is to change it into a decimal. You need a decimal spot if you're going to turn it into a decimal. All right? So now I'm no longer interested in 3/4. I'm going to use 75 over 100. All right? Now, that's step 2. I changed the fraction into a base 10 denominator. Step 3, put the numerator in the denominator's decimal spot. What that means is I'm going to put 75 in the hundredth spot, which means the hundredth spot is 2 places behind the decimal point. 75. The 7 and the 5 can't go in the second spot, so it's just 75 hundredths. The number has to end in the hundredth spot. All right? Your numerator must end in the hundredth spot. The 75 has to end in the hundreds, right? Which is correct. And step 4, put the whole number to the left of the decimal point. Use 0 if necessary. I don't have any whole numbers, so this is assumed to be 0. All right. I have converted 3/4 into 75 hundredths. Makes sense because 3/4 is 75 cents. All right. That is a conversion to hundredths. Now I'll do you one more where we're converting to thousands. All right. This time I'll give you, let's say 3 5/8. This time I gave you a whole number. All right. But I'm going to change that fraction into a decimal. Same steps apply. Can my denominator, 8, turn into tenths, hundredths, or thousands? Well, let's take a look. 8 times 1 is 8. And 8 times 2 is 16. So 8 times nothing is going to give you 10. So if you can't turn 8 into 10, it can't become tenths. Okay, let's try to see what's close to 100. 8 times 10 is 80. 8 times 11 is 88. 8 times 12 is 96. And 8 times 13 is 104, not 100. 8 times 12 is 96, but you're only 4 more away from 100. You need it to be 8 more. So that means 8 can't turn into hundreds either. And you guessed it, if you have 8s, you need to turn it into thousands. All right? Mr. Trahan, what is 8 times 125 is thousands? All right? 8 times 100 is 800, and 8 times 25 is the extra 200. So 800 plus 200 is 1,000. All right? So when you have 8s, you have to turn it into thousands. All right? So step 1 is completed. My denominator can turn into thousands. Step 2, I'm going to actually change the fraction into thousands. It's going to be 3 and something over 1,000. All right? Well, 8 times 125 is 1,000. Right? So I have to do the same thing to the top number. 5 times 125. Right? If you don't know what it is, 125 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times 2 is 10, 11, 12. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 1 is 6. So 5 over 8 is the same thing as 625 over 1,000. Right? So instead of 3 and 5/8, I'm going to use 3 and 625 over 1,000. Step 2 is complete. I've changed the fraction into a base 10 denominator. Step 3, put the numerator in the denominator's decimal spot. I'm going to put 625 in the thousand spot, right? So I'm working with 3 and 625 over 1,000. To complete step 3 is when I'm turning it actually into a decimal. I'm going to put the numerator 625 into the thousand spot. We say, Mr. Trahan, only one number can go in the thousand spot. Yeah. The last number must be in the thousand spot. Well, the thousand spot is 3 places to the right of the decimal point. 1, 2, 3. This is the thousand spot, which means the 5 has to go in the thousand spot. So that's 5, then that's 2, that's 6. That's 625 thousandths. That's step 3. Step 4, put the whole number to the left of the decimal point. Use 0 if necessary. I actually have a whole number, so we're not going to use 0. We're going to use the whole number 3. Put it to the left of the decimal point. All right? So your answer, 3 and 625 thousandths, is the decimal version of 3 and 5/8. All right? Again, this is Mr. T at Mr. T Do Numbers on YouTube, coming at you with lessons on changing fractions into decimals. All right? One last thing. If you have thirds or sixes or ninths or any derivative of 3, you cannot change that fraction into a decimal. It can't turn into tenths, hundredths, or thousandths. 3 times 3 is 9, not 10. 3 times 33 is 99, not 100. 3 times 333 is 999, not 1,000. So when you have thirds or sixes or ninths or any derivative of 3, you cannot change that fraction into a decimal. You're always going to have an extra decimal part left. All right? So in that case, you won't be able to change that fraction into a decimal. All right? This is Mr. T. At Mr. T Do Numbers. Peace.